It always starts with a phone call, doesn't it? That shrill little jolt in the night that snaps you out of whatever dream you were drifting in, dragging you into something you can't undo. This one came at 12:43 a.m., my time. The number flashing on the screen was international, private. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity, my worst and most loyal friend, won out. The voice on the other end was trembling but dignified, like an old violin string about to snap. "Mr. Hale," she said, "my name is Eleanor Ashford. I was told you can help me." I knew that name. Everyone did. The Ashfords weren't just rich, they were history. A family of pioneering surgeons, research institute founders, and philanthropists who'd had their portraits painted long before it was fashionable. They had hospitals named after them, charities, entire wards of medical schools bearing their crest. Her voice lowered to a whisper. "My son, Alexander, he's gone." I rubbed my eyes. "Gone as in missing?" "Vanished," she said, "from inside the house, and the police," her tone tightened, "are already making mistakes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments, what's your location and what time is it where you are right now? When Eleanor Ashford invited you to her estate, you didn't say no. 48 hours later, I was stepping out of a black car in front of Ashford Manor, its tall Georgian facade lit in soft gold. The air smelled faintly of rain and cedar, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the mechanical hum of a greenhouse fan. Inside, the manor felt less like a home and more like a living museum. Marble busts stared down from niches. The eyes of oil-painted ancestors followed you through corridors, and the rugs were so thick my footsteps barely existed. Eleanor appeared at the top of the grand staircase, tall, silver-haired, wrapped in a deep blue silk robe. She descended slowly, like a queen who just abdicated but wasn't ready to hand over the crown. "He was here," she began, leading me into a long drawing room. The air was warm, perfumed with old wood and burning logs. Tuesday night. He'd come from the Institute. He runs the research division now, you see. And he was agitated. We had dinner. He went to his study after. By morning, her voice cracked slightly, his bed hadn't been slept in. "What about security cameras?" I asked. Her lips tightened. "Every recording from that night is corrupted, static. The system has never failed before." I followed her into the hallway outside Alexander's study. The heavy oak door was shut and a police evidence seal stretched across the frame. "They found it locked from the inside," Eleanor whispered. The butler broke it open. No Alexander, just an open window, a draft, and that smell. She hesitated. Sandalwood. Sandalwood. He never wore sandalwood. She clasped my arm then, her nails cold against my sleeve. "You must find him, Mr. Hale. Alexander is the future of this family." I didn't say what I was thinking, that in my experience, when someone vanished from inside their own locked room, you were either dealing with a very elaborate plan or a very intimate betrayal. As I was shown to my guest room, I caught glimpses of the other family members through half-open doors. A tall man with Alexander's jawline watching me from the top of the stairs, a young woman with dark eyes shutting her bedroom door quickly, an older gentleman stirring tea in a library who didn't acknowledge me at all. Each of them seemed wrapped in their own shadow. That night, I couldn't sleep. The manor was too quiet in some places, too noisy in others. Water pipes clicking, a floorboard creaking where no one walked. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made me sit up. The faintest scrape of a chair leg in the corridor, followed by a soft, deliberate footstep. I stepped into the hallway, but it was empty, save for a single feather lying on the carpet, as though plucked from a pillow, or something else entirely. Downstairs, the study door waited, sealed shut, holding its secrets. And somewhere in that house, I felt certain someone was awake, listening and smiling in the dark. Dinner at Ashford Manor was an event, not a meal, the kind where the food is plated like art and the wine is older than you. That night, Eleanor insisted I join the family. She said it would help me get a feel for things. I suspected it was more about her watching how her family watched me. The dining room was long and candlelit, the table gleaming like black glass. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the night, though I could still hear the occasional crackle of rain against the windows. The air smelled faintly of roasted duck and thyme, though beneath it I caught something else, an antiseptic tang, like the inside of a hospital. We were 8 at the table, including me. Eleanor presided at one end, regal and perfectly still. To her right sat Marcus, Alexander's younger brother, with the posture of someone perpetually ready to pounce. His fiancée, Celeste, was all sharp cheekbones and eyes that darted too quickly. Across from them was Helena, Eleanor's sister, who wore so much jewelry it was a miracle she could lift her fork. And then there was Dr. Samuel Ashford, a cousin who ran the Ashford Institute's surgical program, and who had the quiet, assessing look of a man who'd seen more blood than daylight. No one mentioned Alexander at first. Conversation drifted around banal topics, upcoming charity events, a shipment of rare orchids for the greenhouse, a renovation to the East Wing. But the silences between those topics were longer than they should have been, and each time they came, I could feel someone's gaze slide toward me, just for a moment, before moving away. It was Marcus who finally broke the facade. "So," he said, swirling his wine, "you're here to investigate?" I nodded. "Mrs. Ashford asked me to." "Interesting," Celeste murmured. "The police are already involved. I suppose we should be grateful for an outsider's perspective." Her tone suggested she was anything but. Helena leaned forward, bracelets clinking. Alexander was always sensitive, brilliant, but restless. He would disappear for days when he was younger, but he always came back. "That was years ago," Eleanor said sharply, her voice like a knife against porcelain, "and this is different." The room fell quiet again, except for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. I noticed Samuel watching Eleanor, then glancing at Marcus. The two exchanged the briefest of looks. There was history there, something unspoken and well-rehearsed. Halfway through the main course, I caught a whisper. It was Celeste, leaning toward Marcus, her voice so low it was almost inaudible. "We shouldn't have at dinner." The rest was lost in the scrape of silverware. When dessert arrived, delicate lemon tarts with sugared petals, Eleanor excused herself, claiming fatigue. One by one, the others drifted away until only Samuel and I remained. "You think this is about money?" he asked suddenly. I think," I said. "Families like yours don't lose people without reason." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "In this family, reason isn't the problem. It's motive. We always have too many." When I left the dining room, I didn't go straight to my room. Instead, I took a slow walk through the hallways, the candle sconces flickering against the paneled walls. That's when I noticed something odd about Alexander's study. The police seal was still intact, but there were faint scuff marks along the doorframe, fresh, as though someone had been trying to wedge something inside. Back in my room, I jotted down notes, the glances at dinner, the antiseptic smell, the locked study, the feather in the hallway the night before, and that whisper from Celeste, "We shouldn't have at dinner." By the time I turned out the lamp, the rain had stopped. The silence in the manor was absolute, too absolute. And somewhere in that quiet, I felt again that same awareness from the night before, that someone was awake, moving, and keeping just far enough away to make sure I knew it. Morning at Ashford Manor felt like waking inside a painting. Sunlight filtered weakly through the high windows, laying pale gold stripes across the corridors. Somewhere downstairs, china clinked, and the faint scent of butter and fresh coffee drifted upward. It all looked and smelled serene, exactly the kind of peace that hides a storm. After breakfast, Eleanor approached me in the corridor, her hands folded in front of her as though bracing herself. "I'll allow you into Alexander's study," she said, "but you'll understand the police would not approve." She led me to the heavy oak door with its fractured evidence seal. The butler, an elderly man named Price, produced a ring of keys that looked as though they belonged to a cathedral. The lock gave with a deep, reluctant click. The study was dim, the curtains drawn halfway, letting in a blade of cold morning light. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Faint sandalwood, just as Eleanor had described, curling in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. The room was orderly, too orderly. No sign of a struggle. Shelves lined with medical journals, antique surgical tools displayed in glass cases, framed diplomas, and a large mahogany desk, its surface bare except for a lamp and an empty blotter. "Where's his journal?" I asked. Eleanor frowned. "He kept it locked in the top drawer." Price found the drawer empty. I knelt beside the desk, examining the wood. On the underside, I found fresh scratches in the varnish, as though something sharp had been dragged across it. When I slid the bottom drawer open, a folded scrap of paper was wedged at the back. The paper was blank, but faint impressions of writing could be seen when I tilted it toward the light. "I'll need to try a graphite lift on this," I said. Eleanor nodded, distracted. She was staring at the open window. "The latch was broken," she murmured. "Police said he must have climbed out." I looked down. The drop to the lawn was 20 feet onto gravel. No sign of a ladder, no marks on the sill, and in the corner of the frame a single smudge of something pale, chalky, almost white. I scraped a sample into an envelope. Price hovered in the doorway. "There's also this," he said, producing a small black notebook. "Found under the settee this morning." The cover was embossed with a gold crest, the Ashford crest, and inside were pages of tightly written notes in Alexander's hand, only they weren't diary entries. They were lists, dates, initials, and short phrases like Phase 2 complete and subject unresponsive, transfer recommended. "Medical trials?" I asked Eleanor, her lips pressed together, a muscle twitching in her jaw. Alexander was head of the Institute's research division. He oversaw dozens of projects, many of them confidential. I flipped to the last entry. It was dated the night he disappeared. Just 2 words, Whispering Grounds. Eleanor stiffened. "You mustn't take that literally. It's just an old name for the South Gardens." But later, as I left the study, I noticed something. The corridor outside was lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors, all stern, unsmiling, save for one, an 18th century surgeon with the faintest smirk, painted with a candlelit chapel in the background. And there, on the chapel steps, were faintly drawn figures, barely visible unless you looked closely. That afternoon, I walked the South Gardens. The gravel paths twisted between yew hedges tall enough to block out the horizon. Eventually, I came to a small, weather-stained chapel, its wooden doors chained shut, the lock crusted with rust. A weather vane creaked overhead in the mild wind. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, almost too faint to trust my own ears, voices, low, rhythmic, chanting. When I stepped back, the air seemed colder, and somewhere deep in the hedges I thought I saw movement, a flash of dark fabric, vanishing behind the greenery. Eleanor found me back in the Manor's library that evening, leafing through a family history book I'd pulled from the highest shelf. She seemed smaller in the firelight, her silk robe drawn tightly around her shoulders, her voice low. "There's something you should know about Alexander," she began. "Something the others would never tell you." She sat across from me, the flames painting gold in her silver hair. 3 days before he vanished, one of the most valuable things in this family's possession disappeared as well, a diamond and sapphire medallion. It's been with the Ashfords since the 1700s, gifted to our ancestor by the crown itself. We call it the Heart of St. Bridget. I set the book down. "And it went missing right before Alexander did?" "Yes." She stared into the fire. "It was meant to be passed to him when he assumed the role of chairman of the Institute this summer. And now, both are gone." "Any sign of a break-in?" "No. The display case in the private vault was undisturbed, except for the empty stand. Whoever took it knew the access codes." "Family, then," I said. She didn't flinch. "Perhaps, but the medallion's history is complicated. It was once part of the ceremonial regalia for the Ashford Trust, our charitable wing, and long before that, it belonged to a religious order. Some say it was stolen from them. Others claim it was a gift in exchange for something. I thought of the chapel in the gardens, chained but not silent. Alexander knew the stories, she continued. He believed the medallion's inscription, an old Latin phrase, was connected to our family's medical innovations. He was obsessed with decoding it, spent hours in the archives, said it could change the course of our work. I leaned forward. And who knew about that obsession? Her eyes lifted, and for a moment I saw hesitation. Marcus, Samuel, and she paused. Celeste, she encouraged him. I filed that away. The Ashfords didn't seem like the sort to encourage each other unless it served a purpose. After Eleanor left, I decided to see the vault myself. It was located 2 floors below, behind a steel door disguised as part of the wine cellar wall. Price, reluctant but obedient, unlocked it for me. The air inside was cool, with a faint smell of dust and metal. Most of the vault's contents were stored in glass cases, medals, rare surgical instruments, signed treaties. One case stood open, its velvet stand empty. Beneath it, on the polished wood floor, I noticed a faint crescent mark, like something heavy and round had been dragged slightly before being lifted. On the far wall, a brass plaque listed generations of Ashford Institute chairmen. Alexander's name had already been engraved at the bottom, though the date beside it was still blank. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a thin trail of white powder in the corner. I touched it to my tongue. Chalk. The same texture as the smudge on Alexander's window frame. Back upstairs, the manor felt unusually quiet. Too quiet. I passed the long gallery of portraits again and stopped at the smirking surgeon with the chapel in the background. This time, I noticed something I'd missed before, a faint outline on his chest, painted in the same deep blues and reds I'd seen in photographs of the medallion, the heart of St. Bridget, and just below it, hidden in the shadowed folds of his coat, a Latin inscription so faded it was almost invisible. My Latin was rusty, but I could make out enough. Through the body, the soul ascends. That night, as the manor settled into its unnatural stillness, I found myself lying awake, staring at the dark ceiling. Somewhere out in those gardens was a chapel that still breathed with voices, and somewhere in this house, the medallion and perhaps Alexander were closer than anyone dared to admit. The next morning, the fog rolled in thick over the south gardens, swallowing the hedges and statues in a soft gray shroud. I slipped out before breakfast, taking the gravel path toward the chapel. The damp air clung to my coat, carrying that earthy scent of wet leaves and stone. Up close, the building was smaller than I'd expected, more of a chapel mausoleum hybrid, with ivy twisting over its arched windows. The chains on the double doors were still in place, the rust flakes fresh against the wood. But the air, it wasn't still. It carried a faint vibration, as if something inside was humming at the edge of hearing. I moved along the wall, testing the narrow stained glass windows. Most were bolted, but one at the back had a loosened frame. I wedged it up and peered in. The interior was dim, lit by slanted beams of fog-diluted light from the opposite side. Pews were draped in dusty cloth, and at the far end stood an altar carved from dark stone. Behind it, a mural of St. Bridget, though the saint's face was oddly obscured, either by time or by deliberate design. And then I heard it. Faint, rhythmic chanting. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the cadence was too deliberate, low voices rising and falling together in a strange, almost medical precision. The words were muffled, but I caught fragments of Latin, something about the body as vessel. I stepped back quickly when I thought I saw movement near the altar. A figure in dark clothing shifted in the shadows, but before I could get a better look, the chanting stopped. Dead silence. I didn't wait for whatever came next. Back at the manor, breakfast was already underway. Marcus was in unusually high spirits, laughing at some remarks Celeste had made. When he noticed me, his smile thinned. "Out for a walk in this weather?" he asked. "Just exploring," I said. "Your gardens have atmosphere." Celeste's gaze flicked up, curious but guarded. Most guests avoid the south gardens. Too damp, too overgrown, bad for the lungs. Eleanor arrived late, carrying a folded sheet of paper. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice tight, "this was delivered this morning, slipped under the front door." She handed it to me. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and unmarked, except for a short message in block letters. "Return what was taken." Midnight. Whispering Grounds. "Come alone." Marcus read over my shoulder. "That's absurd. It's a prank." "It's not," I said, folding it into my pocket. Helena looked pale. "We shouldn't even." Eleanor cut her off. "Enough. If someone knows where Alexander is, we cannot ignore it." The rest of the day passed in a slow drip of tension. I noticed Samuel watching me from across rooms, always at a distance. Celeste kept her voice low with Marcus, their conversations ending abruptly when I came near. And Helena, who seemed the most frightened, vanished into her rooms entirely. At 1:45, I left my guest room and slipped outside. The fog had thickened again, muffling my footsteps on the gravel. The south gardens were utterly still, until they weren't. As I neared the chapel, the chains on the doors were gone. The heavy wood stood ajar, revealing a sliver of candlelight inside. I stepped in slowly. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of burning wax and sandalwood. The altar was lit by a ring of candles. In its center sat an empty stand, velvet lined, just big enough to hold the heart of St. Bridget. And in the far corner, half hidden by shadows, was something else, a fresh footprint in the dust. Not mine. I wasn't alone. The footprint stopped me cold. Clear tread lines pressed into the layer of dust pointing toward the altar. Whoever left it hadn't been gone long. The edges were still sharp, unsoftened by settling grit. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The candle flames wavered slightly, though there was no breeze. Somewhere deep in the chapel, a faint creak echoed, like weight shifting on old wood. My eyes swept the room. Aside from the velvet-lined stand at the altar's center, the rest of the chapel was a collection of shadows and shapes. A toppled pew, the draped remains of a pulpit, walls that seemed to lean inward as though listening. The sandalwood scent was stronger here, layered over the wax. It clung in the back of my throat, the same as in Alexander's study. I thought of Eleanor's voice that first night. He never wore sandalwood. I moved toward the footprint, careful not to disturb the dust. Just beyond it, partially hidden behind the altar, I saw a fragment of black leather, a glove, crumpled and stiff. Inside, faint smears of something pale, chalky. Before I could examine it further, there was another sound, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step, then another. "Alexander?" My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, swallowed by the heavy air. No reply. I turned toward the source. Between two pews, a shadow slid out of sight. The movement was human, smooth, intentional, not the twitch of an animal. My heartbeat picked up, each thud loud in my ears. I followed, the candlelight stretching my shadow along the wall. The space between the pews opened into a narrow side passage I hadn't noticed from the window. At its end was a wooden door, its iron handle slick with condensation. The chanting I'd heard the day before was absent now, but something else replaced it. A faint, steady tapping from beyond that door, like metal striking stone. I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers brushed it, the tapping stopped. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. Not sandalwood, not wax, but antiseptic. And in the dim, cramped space beyond, a single object waited on a low table, a leather-bound ledger, open to a page scrawled with Alexander's handwriting. The heading at the top read only 2 words, Surgeon's Ledger. The ledger's pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting, Alexander's, if Eleanor was to be believed. Each line was a record, a date, a series of initials, and a brief note. Most were clinical, subject stable, awaiting results, procedure repeated, improved tolerance, but some carried an unsettling tone, almost ritualistic. The offering accepted, body ready for ascension. One date caught my eye. 2 days before Alexander vanished, he'd written, Phase 2 complete, deliver to grounds. The words deliver to grounds were underlined twice. As I skimmed the entries, a shadow crossed the candlelight behind me. I spun, but the narrow side passage was empty. The air felt heavier now, warmer, as if someone had just been standing over my shoulder. I slipped the ledger into my coat and backed out of the chapel. The fog outside pressed in like a living thing, curling around the hedges, swallowing the gravel path until I could barely see 2 steps ahead. Somewhere to my left, a twig snapped. I didn't look. Whoever it was, they were keeping pace with me all the way back to the manor. Inside, the house felt no safer. The corridors were dim, only a few sconces lit. As I passed the drawing room, I caught sight of Samuel in an armchair, a drink in hand, staring into the fire. He didn't speak, but his eyes flicked to my coat, almost knowingly, before he looked away. Back in my guest room, I locked the door and began to read the ledger more carefully. Several entries referenced something called the Pact, capital P. Others mentioned test subjects, identified only by initials. The most recent names matched none of the Ashford family, except one. H.A. Helena Ashford. The note beside it read, "Refused consent, override applied." I didn't hear the knock at first. It was that soft. 3 taps. When I opened the door, Celeste was standing there, her face pale, her hair loose as if she'd left her room in a hurry. "You shouldn't be in the chapel," she whispered. I waited, but she didn't explain. "I saw you," she said finally, "and I know what you found." Her gaze dropped to the ledger in my hand. "If you keep going, you'll end up like Alexander." She turned to leave, then hesitated. "Midnight isn't the only time they meet." Her voice dropped lower. "Check the Institute." The door closed, leaving me in silence. I didn't sleep that night. The smell of sandalwood seemed to linger in the room now, and just before dawn I could swear I heard footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, stopping right outside my door. When I looked, the corridor was empty, except for a folded piece of paper on the carpet. One line written in block letters, "River Lorne, look before it's gone." By mid-morning, the fog had thinned enough to make the trip to the River Lorne. It cut along the edge of the Ashford estate like a silver scar, slow-moving but deceptively deep. The air down there was cooler, sharp with the smell of wet stone and moss. The banks were slick, scattered with driftwood and dead leaves. I followed the water line, scanning for anything that didn't belong. Half a mile upstream, near a cluster of leaning willows, something caught the light, a small metallic glint half buried in the mud. I knelt, brushing away the damp earth. A watch. Its casing was scratched, the crystal spider-webbed with cracks. The second hand was frozen in place at exactly 2:47 a.m. The engraving on the back read, "To Alexander. For every hour we wait, E." The mud around it was disturbed, as though someone had been digging hastily. I widened the search, pushing aside reeds and debris until I uncovered another clue. A torn scrap of black cloth, its edge frayed, smeared with the same pale, chalky residue I'd seen on Alexander's window, and the glove in the chapel. The sound of movement pulled my head up. Across the river, just visible through the willow branches, a figure in a dark coat stood watching me. Too far to make out a face, but still. They didn't move, didn't call out, just watched. When I took a step toward the water, they turned and melted into the trees. Back at the manor, Eleanor was waiting in the library. I placed the watch on the desk between us. Her hand trembled as she touched it. "I gave him this," she said quietly, "on the day he took over the research division." "Do you recognize the time it stopped at?" I asked. She shook her head. "But Alexander often worked late. Sometimes he would leave for the Institute in the early hours, if something happened there." "That's twice now I've been told to look at the Institute," I said. Her expression changed, fear, but not surprise. "If you go, be careful. There are parts of that building even I have never seen." I didn't have to wait long for an excuse to visit. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. "We have a staff meeting at the Institute in an hour. You should come." The drive into town was uneventful, but the Institute itself was a different story. A modern structure of glass and steel, it still carried an air of cold detachment, like a place built to impress investors, not to comfort patients. The entrance hall smelled faintly of disinfectant, and somewhere beneath it, the faintest whiff of sandalwood. Samuel guided me through the public areas, research labs, conference rooms, a pristine auditorium. But it was a locked elevator at the end of a service corridor that caught my attention. A worn brass keyhole. No label. "That's a maintenance shaft," Samuel said casually, but his tone was too quick, too light. When his phone rang, he excused himself, leaving me alone. I tried the elevator. Locked. But a faint vibration under the metal door suggested it had been used recently. As I turned away, I noticed a security camera above the service door. Its lens was pointed down the hall, directly at me. And unlike the Manor's system, this one was on. By the time I returned to the main lobby, Samuel was waiting, smile fixed. "Find what you were looking for?" "Not yet," I said. That night, back in my room, I opened the ledger again. One of the last entries mentioned the river, the exact date of the watch's frozen time, and 3 words underlined twice: transfer complete, chapel. Whatever Alexander had been working on, the river wasn't where it ended. It was just where something or someone had been passed along. The next morning, I was woken by the creak of floorboards outside my door. Light from the hall seeped in through the crack along with the faint smell of sandalwood. When I opened the door, the corridor was empty, but halfway down, near the servants' stairwell, a thin trail of wet footprints glistened on the polished wood. Bare feet, small. They led downward, vanishing halfway along the stone steps. A cold draft curled up from below. I followed it into the old wine cellar, where the air was damp and heavy, the ceiling low enough to make me stoop. Rows of dust-coated bottles lined the walls, but it was the far corner that caught my eye. A rack of crates had been moved recently, its outline on the dusty floor still visible. Behind it, a narrow brick archway, bricked over but with mortar so new it hadn't yet hardened fully. I pressed my ear to it. Nothing. At first. Then a sound like slow, deliberate breathing. The cellar door above slammed shut. I spun around, the dim bulb swaying overhead. The breathing had stopped. The silence was thick, as if the whole house was holding its breath with me. Later, when I confronted Eleanor about the bricked archway, she didn't deny it. "It's a passage," she admitted, her voice low. "It hasn't been used for decades. Or at least, it wasn't supposed to be." She explained that the passage once connected the manor to the village chapel, used by the family to attend services in winter without braving the snow. But after a collapse injured 2 servants in 1953, it had been sealed, officially. "Unofficially?" I prompted. Her eyes flicked to the floor. "Some of my family believe the passage is sacred, a place where messages can be received. Alexander never spoke to me about it, but I saw him down there once. He was carrying a box." I told her about the breathing, the new mortar, the footprints. She paled. "Then he isn't the only one who's been using it." That evening, I returned to the cellar with a small chisel and a flashlight. The mortar crumbled easily, and soon I had cleared enough to peer through. The passage was narrow, the floor uneven. The air smelled of damp stone, candle wax, and something metallic like rust or blood. I crawled inside, the light from my torch catching on the rough brick walls. After a few yards, I found scraps of paper scattered on the ground. Most were blank, but one had writing. A date from 2 weeks before Alexander vanished, and the words, "Await the tide." The passage curved downward, and I began to hear it, a faint hum, low and constant. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I got closer to the chapel end, it took on a rhythm, almost like chanting. I was still 10 feet from the sealed chapel entrance when the hum stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps rushing toward me from the other side. I backed away, nearly tripping, and scrambled out into the cellar. The moment my feet hit the stone floor, the breathing returned, this time from directly behind me. I turned the flashlight, but the beam caught only dust motes swirling in the stale air. No one was there. When I reached my room, a slip of paper was waiting on my pillow. The handwriting was tight, deliberate. "Do not open the chapel end." There was no signature, but the smell clinging to the paper was sandalwood. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that narrow passage, its curve vanishing into darkness, and heard the echo of footsteps approaching. By the time the sky outside had shifted from black to the dull gray of pre-dawn, I had made up my mind. If someone didn't want me opening the chapel end, I needed to know why. Over breakfast, Eleanor barely touched her food. She kept glancing toward the hallway, as though listening for something. I asked her directly about sandalwood, about who in the household used it. Her spoon froze midair. "Only my Uncle Henry," she said quietly. "He uses it in his study, for meditation." Uncle Henry was the oldest surviving member of the family, nearly 80, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I hadn't seen much of him since arriving, except at meals, where he rarely spoke. That morning, I decided to change that. His study was on the second floor, tucked away at the far end of a corridor lined with portraits. The smell reached me before I even got to the door, sweet, smoky sandalwood, thick enough to taste. I knocked, but there was no answer. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the shelves. On the desk lay a map of the estate, dated 1892, showing a network of passages crisscrossing beneath the manor and extending into the village. The sealed chapel passage was clearly marked, but so were 3 others I had never heard of. Beside the map sat a stack of notebooks, each labeled with a date. The most recent was from just a month ago. I opened it. Page after page of tightly written notes described gatherings held in the passageways, small groups chanting in near darkness, sometimes fasting for days. A floorboard creaked behind me. "Curious, aren't you?" Henry's voice was low, but it carried. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, a thin smile on his lips. He didn't ask me to put the notebook down. Instead, he walked past me and sat at the desk, fingers steepled. "You're here for Alexander," he said. "And you've already been to the cellar. I can smell the mortar dust on you." I didn't deny it. Why was the passage reopened? Henry studied me for a long moment. Because some doors should never have been closed. Alexander understood that. He was willing. The way he said it made my skin crawl. Willing for what? You'll see. But understand this. He wasn't taken. He went where he wanted to go. Before I could press further, Henry closed the notebook and slid it into a drawer, locking it with a small brass key. "Stay out of places you don't belong," he said, "especially at night." That evening, the storm returned. Rain lashed against the windows, and the manor's old walls groaned. I waited until the house was quiet, then slipped down to the cellar again. This time, I brought rope, extra batteries, and a camera. The moment I crawled back into the passage, I knew something was different. The hum was louder now, pulsing like a heartbeat through the stone. The air was warmer too, as though the walls themselves were radiating heat. When I reached the curve, I stopped. Light, faint but steady, was coming from the chapel end. Shadows moved across it, slow and deliberate, like figures passing before a fire. I crept closer, pressing my ear to the final stretch of brick. Voices filtered through, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The tone was low, almost hypnotic, but now and then a word would rise above the rest. My name. The chanting stopped. Then something scraped against the bricks on the other side. A voice, closer now, whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The light vanished. I scrambled backward, my flashlight flickering, the hum fading to silence. But before I could reach the cellar, a piece of paper slid through a crack between the bricks and landed at my feet. I picked it up. 4 words, written in the same tight hand as before. "He is not gone." I sat on the cellar floor for a long time, staring at that slip of paper. The ink was still fresh, smudged at the edges where the damp air had kissed it. Whoever had written it had been right there, only inches from me. Back in my room, I couldn't shake the thought of Alexander walking these same passages, maybe even still doing so now. If he wasn't gone, as the note claimed, then where exactly was he? And why did everyone, from Eleanor to Uncle Henry, seem more intent on keeping me away from the answer than finding him? By morning, I had a plan. I'd follow the other passages marked on Henry's old map. If one led to Alexander, I'd find it. I waited until after lunch, when most of the household had slipped into the long, drowsy lull of the afternoon. The corridors were quiet as I slipped into Henry's study. The scent of sandalwood still lingered, like a warning, but the room was empty. The map was gone from the desk, but the drawer he'd locked was not. One of the perks of growing up with a locksmith father, I've always been good with simple locks. 2 minutes later, the brass keyhole yielded with a satisfying click. Inside was the map, along with a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. They were addressed to A.H. Laurent, Alexander Henry Laurent. The earliest letters were years old, filled with philosophical musings about purification, returning to the source, and the unbinding of the self. The last letter, dated 2 weeks before his disappearance, simply read, open quote, "Brotherhood gathers beneath the chapel on the night of the new moon. The veil will open," close quote. And at the bottom was a smaller note in Henry's own hand, "Bring only those who will not turn back." I copied the locations of the other passages from the map, then replaced everything exactly as I had found it. The first passage entrance was in the disused conservatory beneath a rotting panel of floorboards. It smelled of damp earth and crushed leaves. Unlike the chapel route, this one was narrow from the start, roots breaking through the walls like twisted fingers. The deeper I went, the more the air changed, warmer, almost metallic, with the faint thrum of that same heartbeat hum. After about 50 feet, the tunnel split in two. I took the left branch, which ended in a wooden hatch. Not a proper door, more like a trap door, bolted from the other side. I knocked lightly. Something knocked back. 3 slow raps. I froze. "Alexander?" No answer, but the knocking came again. 3 slow raps, then silence. I pulled at the hatch, but it didn't budge. Peering through a crack, I caught a glimpse of movement, a pale shape retreating into the dark. I don't know how long I stared, calling softly into the gap. When I finally gave up, my knees ached and my flashlight was fading. Back at the manor, I tried to act normal through dinner, though I caught Henry watching me more than once. Eleanor seemed withdrawn, her eyes fixed on her plate. When I finally asked if she had seen Alexander since the night he vanished, she said nothing, just slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a calendar page. Tomorrow's date was circled in red. Beneath it, in her handwriting, was a single word: chapel. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay listening to the creak of the house, the faint patter of rain on the roof. At some point, the scent of sandalwood seeped under my door. I checked the hall. It was empty. But down at the far end, near the stairwell to the cellar, I saw it, a flicker of candlelight moving slowly out of sight. Someone was already heading for the chapel. I didn't even bother putting on shoes, just pulled on my coat, grabbed the flashlight, and slipped into the hallway. The candlelight had vanished, but the faint scent of sandalwood still lingered in the air, like a trail meant for me to follow, or perhaps a warning to keep me away. The cellar door was ajar. I eased it open, wincing at the groan of the hinges, and crept down the steps. My breath fogged in the chill, and every creak of the wooden treads felt loud enough to carry for miles. The passage to the chapel was colder than usual, as though the air itself were bracing for something. My footsteps echoed softly, each one quickly swallowed by the stone. Then I heard it, the low hum. No longer the faint vibration from before, but deeper now, steady, like the bass note of some ancient instrument played far away. When I reached the trapdoor, the chapel above was dimly lit by a handful of candles, their flames swaying as if stirred by unseen hands. Figures in dark robes stood in a loose circle around the altar. One of them was Eleanor. Her hair was pinned back, her face pale but resolute. In her hand was a small brass key. At the center of the circle, on the floor, rested a large wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate spirals and symbols I didn't recognize. The hum was coming from inside. I pressed my back to the wall, keeping to the shadows. One of the robed figures knelt and unlocked the chest with the key Eleanor handed over. As the lid creaked open, the hum swelled. My flashlight felt suddenly heavy in my hand, and I had to fight the urge to switch it on just to break the darkness. Inside, I could barely make out shapes, bundled fabric, perhaps, but then one of the figures reached in and pulled something upright. It was a mask. Not decorative, not theatrical. This thing looked ancient. Its surface was cracked and pitted, but the eyes were hollow, wide, and perfectly round. The tallest figure, unmistakably Uncle Henry, took the mask in careful hands. His voice was low and steady, reciting words I didn't understand. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the shadows where I hid, and for a heartbeat I thought she would call me out. Instead, she looked away. The group began to sway gently, their voices blending into a single, continuous tone that matched the hum. It was hypnotic. My knees felt unsteady, my thoughts fogging, until I realized the hum wasn't only a sound, it was vibrating up through the floor and into my chest. Then the air shifted. A breeze that had no right to exist inside a sealed chapel brushed past me, carrying the faint scent of something metallic, like old coins. The candle flames bent toward the altar, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. Henry lifted the mask, holding it before his face, but did not put it on. Instead, he spoke in English for the first time that night. "Bring him forward." Two of the robed figures moved toward the far corner of the chapel and dragged someone out. His clothes were torn, his head bowed, but I knew the shape of those shoulders instantly. Alexander. My first instinct was to rush forward, to shout, but my throat locked. Not yet. They guided Alexander to the center and forced him to his knees. Henry held the mask before him. The hum deepened, pressing against my ears until I thought they might burst. Alexander looked up, and I swear, for just a moment, he saw me. His eyes widened, his lips parted, but before he could speak, Henry lowered the mask toward his face. The candles sputtered violently. The hum hit a pitch so high it rattled the windows in their frames. And then, darkness. Every flame went out. The hum stopped. When my vision adjusted, the circle of figures was gone. So was Alexander. The only thing left on the floor was the mask, lying face up, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I didn't want to touch it. The mask lay on the cold stone floor, just far enough away that I would have to step fully into the ring of candles to reach it. Its hollow eyes caught the faintest glint of moonlight filtering through the high, narrow windows. For a long moment, I just listened. Nothing. No hum. No shuffle of feet. Not even the distant creak of old wood settling. The chapel had fallen completely silent, and my heartbeat felt far too loud in the stillness. Still, I couldn't leave it there. If they came back, if this object was important enough to make Alexander disappear, I wasn't going to let them keep it. I stepped forward, the cold biting through my socks, and crouched. The moment my fingertips brushed its surface, a shiver ran up my arm. The mask wasn't stone or wood, it felt like something in between. Warm, despite the chill in the room. I slipped it into my coat, the curved surface pressing uncomfortably against my ribs, and backed toward the trapdoor. My flashlight shook in my hand, its beam trembling over the walls, the altar, and the empty space where they had stood only minutes before. The passage back to the cellar felt longer this time. My breaths came short, my ears tuned to every faint sound behind me. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, keeping pace with mine. But when I turned the beam back, the stone tunnel was empty. When I emerged into the cellar, I locked the trapdoor behind me, though I knew a flimsy bolt wouldn't stop whatever had just happened down there. I had to find Alexander. I had to get Eleanor away from them, if she even wanted to leave. Upstairs, the manor was still. The grandfather clock in the hall read 3:17 a.m. I crept to Alexander's room. The door was ajar, but the bed was made untouched. No sign of struggle. It was as if he had never been there at all. My thoughts spun. If they had taken him, where could they have gone? The nearest road was a mile away, and there had been no sound of cars. That left the woods, or something else entirely. I decided to try Eleanor's room next. Her door was locked. I knocked softly. No answer. I pressed my ear to the wood and thought I heard movement, slow pacing, then a faint creak as if someone had sat down on the bed. "Eleanor," I whispered. The pacing stopped. Silence. Then So faint, I almost thought I imagined it. She whispered back, "Don't trust anyone here, not even me." A cold weight settled in my chest. Before I could respond, a floorboard creaked down the hall, heavy footsteps moving fast. I backed away from her door just as Uncle Henry turned the corner. His eyes met mine, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You shouldn't be wandering at night," he said, his voice low and even. "It's not safe." I wanted to throw the words back at him, demand to know where Alexander was, but I forced myself to nod. I couldn't sleep. Henry's gaze lingered on me a moment too long. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the corridor. I returned to my room, bolted the door, and sat on the bed with the mask in my lap. My hands traced the cracks and ridges along its surface. Every so often I thought I felt a faint vibration, almost like a purr. I didn't dare put it on, but I couldn't stop staring into its hollow eyes, wondering what Alexander had seen when Henry held it before him. Somewhere in the manor, a door slammed, then another. The sound drew closer, echoing through the hallways. And then, so faint I almost thought it was only in my head, the hum began again. The hum swelled. Not loud, but insistent, like the vibration of an electric wire strung too tight. It seemed to emanate from the very walls, radiating through the wood, into the floorboards, and deep into my bones. I shoved the mask back into my coat pocket and pressed my ear against the door. The hallway beyond was dark, and while the sound wasn't exactly footsteps, there was movement out there, slow, rhythmic. I waited until it passed, then slid the bolt open and stepped into the corridor. The air felt heavier now, almost metallic, as though I'd walked into the back room of a machine shop. A dim glow pulsed at the far end of the hall, the direction Henry had taken earlier. I followed, keeping close to the wall, careful not to let my socks snag on the rough edges of the warped floorboards. The glow grew stronger as I neared the narrow servants' stairwell. A strange scent drifted up, sweet but scorched at the edges, like candied fruit left too long over a flame. At the bottom, the passage opened into the same hallway that led toward the chapel, yet the trapdoor above remained bolted shut. The light, however, spilled from a side corridor I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a rotting wardrobe. Someone had pushed it aside, revealing a stone archway and steps winding deeper into the earth. I cast one last glance behind me, then began to descend. The steps curved, and the hum intensified, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. The walls here were damp, etched with symbols, some crude and hastily scratched, others intricate and deliberate. I passed one that looked unsettlingly like the mask in my pocket, its hollow eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. At the bottom, the space widened into a cavern illuminated by dozens of oil lamps hung in a rough circle. The family, Henry, Eleanor, and others I had only glimpsed in passing, stood around a stone platform. Alexander lay upon it, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling shallowly. No one spoke. The hum came from them, their bodies vibrating in some shared, impossible frequency. Henry held a black-bound book, his lips moving soundlessly as his fingers traced its pages. Eleanor's gaze flicked to mine for the briefest instant, then returned to Alexander, her expression unreadable. I wanted to rush forward, but the moment my foot touched the dirt inside the ring of lamps, every head turned toward me in unison. The hum cut off. "You weren't invited," Henry said. His voice didn't sound like his own. It carried a strange depth, layered with echoes, as though others were speaking through him. "I'm taking him," I said, though my voice shook. Henry's lips curved into a faint smile. "You can't. Not yet." He gestured, and Eleanor stepped forward. She held out her hands, and I realized she wanted the mask. Every instinct screamed at me not to give it to her, but the air itself seemed to press inward, making it hard to breathe. When I didn't move, two of the others stepped forward and gripped my arms. Their hold was like iron, and the moment they touched me, my legs went weak. Eleanor slipped the mask from my coat pocket without a word. She didn't look at me, only carried it to the platform and placed it gently over Alexander's face. The hum rose again, louder now. more urgent. The lamp, though no urgent, swayed, though no breeze moved in the cavern. The symbols on the walls shimmered. Alexander's body jerked once. Then again, his eyes flew open. For a moment, they were not his eyes at all. If you want, I can also create a tighter, more atmospheric version of this that reads like professional Gothic suspense fiction. That would make it even sharper for a novel. The irises were wrong. Too dark, almost swallowing the whites, with a faint ring of gold that seemed to pulse. I stumbled backward, but the grip on my arms kept me in place. Alexander's gaze swept over the gathered faces, then locked onto mine. A faint smile curved his lips, but it wasn't his smile. "You've been curious," he said softly. His voice was layered, like Henry's had been, but colder, threaded with something ancient. I tried to speak, to demand they let him go, but my mouth was dry, my tongue heavy. Around us, the hum shifted into something closer to chanting, low, overlapping voices that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. Eleanor stepped beside the platform, her expression reverent, almost fearful. "The bridge is open," she said. Henry nodded and began to read from the book again. I caught fragments, names, places, phrases in a language that twisted in my ears like smoke. Alexander sat up slowly, the mask still in place, and the oil lamps flared brighter, their flames stretching unnaturally tall. The air thickened until every breath felt like pulling syrup into my lungs. My vision tunneled. The room seemed to tilt, its edges warping. I realized then that the cavern was older than the house above it, older than the family itself. The symbols carved into the stone weren't decorative. They were anchors, holding something in or keeping something out. Alexander slid from the platform and walked toward me. His steps were unhurried, almost graceful. The others parted for him like water. He stopped just inches away. "You wanted the truth," he whispered. "Now you'll carry it." Before I could move, he pressed the mask into my chest. It was cold, so cold it burned. My captors released me, and I fell to my knees, clutching it. The chanting rose to a crescendo. The flames bent inward toward Alexander, and for a heartbeat, every lamp went out. When they flared back to life, he was gone. The platform was empty. No one reacted. They simply turned and began filing out of the cavern in silence. Eleanor passed me without a glance. Henry closed the book and tucked it under his arm. I was left kneeling in the dirt, the mask still in my hands. Its eyes seemed deeper now, as if I could fall into them. By the time I made it back to the main floor, dawn light was seeping through the cracks in the shutters. The house was quiet, no sign of Alexander, no sign of the family. I walked out the front door and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I started the engine. The mask sat on the passenger seat, facing me. 2 weeks have passed since that night. I haven't been able to find any record of the family. No property deeds, no birth certificates, nothing. It's as if they never existed. But sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I hear the hum again. And sometimes in the corner of my room, I see Alexander's eyes watching me in the dark. So here we are, at the end. The pieces have all fallen into place, at least the ones I could find. The rest? They're scattered in corners of history that probably aren't meant to be touched. I've thought about burning the mask, burying it, locking it away somewhere it could never be found. But each time I try, something stops me. Not fear, exactly. More like the weight of inevitability. The days have settled into a strange rhythm. I work, I sleep, I pretend things are normal. But my dreams tell a different truth. In them, the house is still standing, the lamps still burning, and Alexander is always just out of reach. Sometimes he's smiling, sometimes he's not. The hum is with me most nights now, faint, like the memory of a song I used to know, and I've started to wonder if it's not coming from outside at all. Maybe it's in me now, like a second heartbeat. What really happened in that cavern is something I'll never be able to explain in any way that makes sense. People like to think mysteries have answers, but some things aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived with, carried, like a shadow that knows your name. So if you've been listening all this time, leaning in closer, maybe you feel it too. That quiet pull in your chest, that slight pressure in the air. Maybe the bridge never really closed. Good night. Sleep well. End of story. Have a good night's sleep.